was recently widowed and newly blind and consigned to a nursing home in a distant outer borough of New York City. "Will you please come visit me?" she asked. Her invitation pointedly included Grandma Lillian as well. My grandfather shared the contents of the letter with our family over our holiday dinner that weekend. He seemed surprised by the request and saddened at Blanche's condition, but nothing in his tone or manner revealed even the remotest inkling of affection for a woman who he hadn't seen in 61 years. His greatest concern appeared to be the length of the bus trip to her facility. "I suppose we have to visit her, now that she's asked," said Grandpa Leo, his voice utterly devoid of romance. He turned to my young cousin and added, "Visiting the sick is a true mitzvah, but never stay with them too long." That prompted my aunt to recount, for my cousin's benefit, the comedic tale of my grandfather's sojourn with Blanche atop the amusement park ride during a lightning storm. Then my father and my aunt each offered to drive my grandparents to the widow's nursing home. "We can even go next weekend," suggested my aunt. "Whatever works best for you." My grandmother had remained silent during this conversation. She'd always been an extraordinarily easygoing person, I should emphasize, certainly one not prone to jealousy or spite. She also never met Blanche, as far as I knew, and she had no reason to dislike the blind widow, other than that the woman had once dated my grandfather. So we were all dumbfounded to see my grandmother in tears. "If you visit that woman, Leo," she warned between sobs, "I'm not going to let you back in our house. Am I making myself clear?" Grandma Lillian could not have been clearer. Nor, when pressed by my grandfather, was she willing to explain herself. "I'm his wife and she's not," said my grandmother. "That's the only explanation anyone needs." So neither of them visited Blanche, and they received no more New Year's cards. My grandparents' marriage continued happily for another 4 years, till my grandfather succumbed to his cancer, and during that time, none of us ever dared raise the subject of Blanche's request again. My aunt, maybe because her own marriage has been such an unhappy one, has always taken an interest in our family's past. Her interest magnified after my grandfather's death, and it was through her efforts to chart my grandmother's genealogy that I first learned of the man who was not my grandfather. That is the best way I have to describe the handsome young Latvian Jew whom my grandmother didn't marry, because even today I still do not know his name. My grandmother insists that she no longer remembers it either, and although I do not believe her, I have stopped asking. We were seated in my grandmother's kitchen, several months after my grandfather's funeral, and my aunt spread across the tabletop a pair of faded photographs that she had acquired from our cousins. One was a group portrait. Here frowned the portly, double-chinned sisters of my Grandma Lillian's father, and their phalanx of stone-faced adult children, 3 rows of Littman cousins decked out for a long-forgotten wedding. In the foreground stood a brigade of sepia toddlers, boys and girls who would now have been in their late 80s. The other photograph depicted one of my grandmother's aunts and her offspring, 5 daughters endowed with Zoptic peasant beauty, and a dashing, mustached son who might have passed for an Italian film star. "He looks like Rudolph Valentino," I said, admiring my grandmother's cousin. "It's hard to believe he's actually related to us. Nobody else in our short, round-faced family, to phrase matters delicately, displays similar Hollywood potential. Are you sure he wasn't a changeling?" "You never met him, Mom, did you?" asked my aunt. "How could I meet him? He was in Europe and I was here." My grandmother dipped a donut into her coffee mug. "I was supposed to marry him, you know, but I wouldn't go through with it. Why should I marry a man I'd never met?" "You were supposed to marry him?" my aunt asked incredulously. "To get them out of Europe, before the war," said Grandma Lillian. "The plan was for us to get married, and then his parents and all of his sisters would come over with him. Maybe his nieces and nephews, too. It was my father's idea." I could sense a strain of irritation rising in my grandmother's voice, as though the wedding proposal had just been pitched to her anew. "Who is he to tell me who to marry?" "You could have married your cousin on paper," I suggested, "and then divorced him as soon as he arrived in the United States. Whoever thought of such craziness back then? It wasn't like things are now. If you got married and stayed married. Nobody got divorced." "So what happened?" I asked. "Nothing happened," she answered. "I married your grandmother." "But what happened to your cousin and his family?" My grandmother looked at me as though I'd asked her if the earth were flat. "I imagine they all died in the war," she said, matter of fact. "My father never mentioned them again. It wasn't something we talked about in those days." "So we don't know for sure," I offered. "They could have survived, but maybe we can find them." "They died in the war," said my grandmother firmly. can you leave it at that? And I'll stop there. If you want to read the rest is available online at Midstream. And now who you've really been waiting for.
Well, it's so nice to read with my friend Jacob. And we've known each other for a long time, and have exchanged work for a long time. So it's an honor to read with him and be asked here. I'm not going to read about medicine, though I guess I could have. I'm working on a series of short essays. Can everyone hear me? And does anyone want to sit down? There are two little seats.
Oh yeah, and we can bring more seats if necessary. You are okay there.
Yeah, it's actually more comfortable.
More comfortable.
Okay, good.
Really?
Yeah. I know that there are always people who prefer the stalls rather than the orchestra, and I am fine with that.
The bleachers.
The bleachers. Okay. I was trying to put it nice.
So I'm just going to read from these short essays I've been working on. They're going to be published in the fall under the title 100 Essays I Don't Have Time to Write. And I think they were, in a way, a placeholder for writing a play. I've had 3 kids over the past 7 years, so the essays are a little bit about writing plays and having kids and the kind of spaces in between. Okay, 1 on interruptions. I remember reading Alice Walker's essay in my 20s about how a woman writer could manage to have 1 child, but more was difficult. At the time, I pledged to have no more than 1, or at the very most 2. I now have 3. I also remember, before having children, reading Tilly Olson, who described with such clarity thinking and ironing and thinking and ironing, and writing while ironing and having many children. She herself had 4. I myself do not iron. My clothes and the clothes of my children are rumpled. The child's need so pressing, so consuming for the mother to be there, to be present, and the pressing need of the writer to be half there, to be there but thinking of other things, caught me. Sorry, in the act of writing that sentence, my son William, who is now 2, came running into my office, crying and asking for a fake knife to cut his fake fruit. So there's also in observing children much of the day and making theater much of the night, this preoccupation with the real and the illusory and the pleasures and pains of both. In any case, please forgive the shortness of these essays. Do imagine the silences that came between, the bodily fluids, the tears, the various shades of. In the middle of that sentence, my son came in and sat at my elbow and said tenderly, "Mom, can I poop here?" I think of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own and how it needs a practical addendum about locks and bolts and soundproofing. But I digress. I could lie to you and say that I intended to write something totalizing, something grand. But I confess that I had a more humble ambition, to preserve for myself in rare private moments some liberty of thought. Perhaps that is equally 7. My son just typed 7 on my computer. There was a time when I first found out I was pregnant with twins that I saw only a state of conflict. When I looked at theater and parenthood, I saw only war, competing loyalties, and I thought my writing life was over. There were times when it felt as though my children were annihilating me. Truly, you've not lived until you've changed one baby's diaper while another quietly vomits on your shin. And finally I came to the thought, all right then, annihilate me, the other self was a fiction anyhow, and then I could breathe and investigate the pauses. I found that life intruding on writing was in fact life, and that tempting as it may be for a writer who is also a parent, one mustn't think of life as an intrusion. At the end of the day, writing has very little to do with writing and much to do with life. And life, by definition, is not an intrusion. Jacob mentioned a play I had, I guess it was 3 years ago on Broadway called In the Next Room, or the Vibrator Play. This is a little essay about that play. 2, on nakedness and sightlines. I do not take lightly the burden of putting a naked actor on the stage. I only request nakedness when the subject matter seems to require it. In my play In the Next Room, or the Vibrator Play, the most intimate scene did not involve vibrators, but instead a woman undressing her husband and seeing his body for the first time. When we did the play at the Lyceum Theater on Broadway, the press asked me constantly about the nakedness. What's the big deal, I would say. But the duration, they would say. It's a matter of seconds, I would say. It's in our face, they would say. Really, I would say? Do you mean to offend the audience, they would say. I was bewildered. Why was a sophisticated New York audience making such a big deal out of a little nakedness on stage? Well, as it happened, the director, Les Waters, and I had been seated at the house left during all the all of the previews. So house left, so that you guys know the theater vaguely, house left is on this side and house right is on this side, and often the people who work on the show get staff seats, which are placed in the same place every night. So we were on house left. We were on house right. Sorry. Sure enough, poor gallant Michael Cerverus was frontally exposed to the audience for an impressive 5 minutes. I had late-night phone calls with Michael and with the exquisite Laura Benanti, who played opposite him. Laura, his penis is upstaging me. They aren't hearing what I'm saying because they're looking at his penis. Michael, unfortunately, my penis is on the same side of my body as my face. Laura, precisely, you're upstaging me. I've invented some of this dialogue to give you the general flavor. In any case, I was determined to fix the situation. On our last day of rehearsal, Les Waters was suffering from a migraine, lying down in the dark. I was 5 months pregnant with twins, full of hormones and possibly a savior complex. I charged to the theater, calling the wonderful Roy Harris, stage manager extraordinaire, a man who has spent a career successfully handling all kinds of desperate people and divas, saying, Roy, I'm coming to rehearsal. We have to fix the sightline problem with Michael's penis. What, said Roy? We've all been sitting on house left, I said, frantic. House right gets full frontal for 5 minutes. No, said Roy, you're not coming to rehearsal to fix Michael's penis. That's Les's job. But Les has a migraine. Roy, it's not your job, Sarah. I, close to tears. But the press comes tonight and the sightlines will never be fixed. Roy, Sarah, go home. Rest up. What, go home? I said, incredulous. Yes, go home, said Roy, emphatic. I was so mad. Go home? So I went home. And Michael's nakedness was bold and beautiful and unashamed. He did not cheat upstage to appease house right. They had to be reminded of reality in that moment, for nakedness is always real on stage, just as eating is real on stage, kissing is real on stage, and dogs on stage are real. And one can only bear reality in small doses. In any case, Michael's bravery triumphed over my desire to placate house right, so they would better hear my dialogue. We opened a week later, and I started to bleed, and my doctor told me to go home immediately on bed rest. Go home, I said, incredulous. Go home, she said, emphatic. And I did. Come on in. There's room in the front. 3. Greek masks and Bell's palsy. I was diagnosed with Bell's palsy, a usually temporary paralysis of the face or cranial nerve, by a lactation consultant. In the hospital while I was nursing, she said, your eye looks a little droopy. And I said, yes, I'm Irish. And she said, that's not what I mean, look in the mirror. And then I looked in the mirror and the left side of my face had fallen down. That side of my face didn't move for about a year. I tried to develop odd ways of signaling approval or friendliness. I vocalized more. I made weird gestures with my hands upon seeing people I liked, as I was unable to smile at them naturally upon recognition. When my babies first smiled at me, I tried to smile back, but I feared the effort looked more like pain. Eventually I learned to blink again, and I stopped drooling, and I could almost whistle and eat spaghetti again, though not at the same time, but I still couldn't smile. One day I was watching auditions for my translation of Chekhov's Three Sisters, and watching all the crying Mashas. Behind these deeply expressive actors was a mirror. I could see myself watching them, expressionless, a mask. And I wondered, do actors need to experience sadness in order to express sadness? Can one experience joy when one cannot express joy on one's face? Does the smile itself create the happiness, or does happiness create the smile? There was once a neurological study that measured actors' physiological condition after acting. There was no difference between an actor who had experienced grief on stage and a regular person who experienced grief. This made me pity actors. But what of symmetry and beauty? Botox creates a paralysis that is symmetrical and therefore beautiful. Bell's palsy creates a paralysis that is asymmetrical and therefore unpleasant. A beautiful smile is nothing if not a flash, a revelation of symmetry. A spontaneous, perhaps slightly aggressive flash of teeth saying, I will not eat you, but I like you. We know biologically that symmetry is pleasing, even fruit flies like it. But where do we put all the asymmetrical people, the asymmetrical stories? Where do we put the crooked people, the people with one leg, lazy eyes, crooked grins? Do we write plays for them? Do we make theaters for them? If symmetry is beauty, but life is asymmetrical, how can art imitate life with an expression of formal beauty that is also true? I do not know. I do know that an old man walked towards me today and smiled at me. Without thinking, I smiled back, crooked but impulsive, and therefore with joy. 4. Everyone is famous in a parade. I love watching my children watching parades. They seem to love the simple act of some people walking down a street, while other people stand still and watch. I think it must be the most basic, simple form of theater. Very little storytelling, and a distinction between the watcher and the watched. No one in the parade is a famous actor, but they are all famous in the parade by virtue of the fact that they happen to be moving, and the other people happen to be standing still. On lice. Lice is the great equalizer. Like death, it comes to everyone. Regardless of hygiene, race, or class, if you have children and they play with other children, eventually they get lice. In urban centers like New York, nearly every domestic enterprise may be outsourced, even the eradication of head lice. I combed my daughter's head for 2 days, proud of my method and dedication, but on the 3rd day, unsuccessful, I gave up and called the lice lady. The lice ladies of Brooklyn live in Ditmas Park and are a large Orthodox family. I find their house comforting. 3 babies crawl on the floor and 2 men read the Talmud. Extended family comes in and out of the kitchen, here grabbing an apple, there dropping off a child. In the kitchen, I plunk down my children to get combed out. The woman combing is named after Moses' wife, Zipporah. She's 22 and has 2 children. Her mother-in-law has 15. I feel that Zipporah and I have a lot in common, much more in common than most of the mothers I meet on the playground, for Zipporah and I both try to work from home. She combs with incredible patience and pragmatism while her baby cries in the other room. Shlomo, she yells to her husband, give the baby a pacifier. Shlomo is a Talmudic scholar. He also works from home. I can't find the pacifier, he shouts. Look, I found 4 baby nits, she says to me, showing me the paper towel, then shouts to Shlomo, go to the study, he probably dropped the pacifier in there. Shlomo sighs, leaves the Talmud, and takes the baby into the study to look for the pacifier. Zipporah says, my husband, he has to study forever. It is now my turn to submit to the treatment. I send the children to look at the fish in the living room aquarium. Zipporah starts combing my hair out. Her combing is gentle than my husband's, and it makes me want to cry to think a stranger would be willing to do this for me. It's almost impossible to comb your own hair for lice when you have long hair. It reminds me that you can't do everything for yourself, that we are in fact primates, that the social contract involves grooming each other. Perhaps that's the metaphysical function of lice, to remind us of our mutual need. An Irish woman and her daughter Nora come in for a quick head check. How do you like Brooklyn? I ask the pretty brunette. Sure as hell beats Belfast, she says. Little Nora says, I like Ireland better, while her head gets checked. They are clear of lice and are thankful. They leave and Zipporah goes back to combing my hair out. Ooh, I found 2 adult ones, big ones, she says. See? Wow, I say, thanks. So you're a writer, she says. That's good, you get to work from home? Yes, I say. Shlomo yells, the pacifier's not in the study, you have to feed him. Zipporah yells back while combing, I already fed him at 6, I'm not feeding him again. Then to me, so you work at home? I try to, I say. I realize that the rhythm at Zipporah's house feels familiar to me, the great systole and diastole of work and children, the revelation of finding a sentence in the midst of chaos, not unlike the joy of finding a buried knit in hair. My kids come back from the fish tank claiming they're starving. Zipporah gives each of them a spoonful of peanut butter and sprinkles some baking powder on my head. And I think, as I'm surrounded by life, parasites, fish, children, I think, so you thought you wanted to observe life? Motherhood shakes her head, clenches her fists, and demands, no, you must live it. Just read a couple more, and then maybe we can talk a little bit. 6, on Ovid. I grew up on Shakespeare's romances, in which people become asses, and this brand of theatrical transformation felt normal to me rather than odd. But in the contemporary literary world, things that are magic are cordoned off and labeled magic realism. Apparently Marquez himself disdained the term, and said that most of what happened in Love in the Time of Cholera actually happened in his village. In the Renaissance, playwrights couldn't get enough of Ovid, the poet of transformation, and Shakespeare seems almost to have slept with Ovid under his pillow. Paula Vogel, who was my playwriting teacher, teaches that there are 6 plot forms. An Aristotelian form, or the linear arc, is only one of them. Aristotelian form progresses through a logical series of cause and effect. One thing happens, so the next thing happens, so the next thing happens, the climax happens, and so on. Vogel explains that alternatives to Aristotelian form include circular form, backwards form, repetitive form, associative form, which is all of Shakespeare's work, where the logic of image following image seems to determine one scene following the next, rather than linear cause and effect. I would humbly add a seventh form, Ovidian. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, he begins, "Let me begin to tell of forms changed." His emphasis in terms of story is on transformation rather than a scene of conflict or rational cause and effect. Gods become swans, people become trees, people fall in love and die, the supernatural world is permeable. This story structure is reminiscent of fairy tales. Objects have magical properties, people transformed, the natural world is likewise transformative. There is no clear moral. If there can be said to be verisimilitude, it is the sort that imitates dreams or the unconscious. There are often beasts, swans, fish, donkeys. Perhaps change is all important in most dramatic forms. In the arc play, change is usually of the moral variety, a lesson learned. But in Ovidian form, the play takes pleasure in change itself, as opposed to pleasure in moral improvement. We now live in an age where people crave magic and transformation. We want Harry Potter. One might argue that we want Harry Potter because of political escapism. That is another matter. Still, I would argue that at the level of story, we crave transformation as much as we crave verisimilitude. I think that Ovidian form is not taught at universities as genuine narrative form because it's very hard to teach the art of transformation. Aristotle lays out his theories in lecture form, easily accessible, whereas Ovid simply flies, and it's difficult to teach the art of flying. I'll just read this one last one of a newcomer. 7. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Last night I was up most of the night with my 3-year-old son William, who had asthma. This morning I thought it would be a good idea to take William and his twin sister Hope to buy new shoes for the summer. They probably hadn't eaten enough breakfast, and I rushed them to the shoe store anyway. As we were leaving the shoe store, they both started crying. Hope took off her shiny new shoes and threw them into the street. "Naughty, Hope," I said. They both kept crying. "What's wrong?" I said. "Are you hungry?" I wheeled them into a bodega and said, "Do you want cheese? Do you want pirate booty? Do you want apple juice? Do you want chocolate milk?" They kept crying and throwing things out of the carriage and kicking. "No, no, no," they said. "What do you want?" I said. Then, "I want M&Ms, screamed William. "No, William," I said. "They don't sell M&Ms before 11 a.m. "I want M&Ms. I want M&Ms. Then I said something that I'm ashamed of. I believe I said something like, "I'll get you M&Ms if you promise to shut your face. Do you promise?" "Yes," he said. I gave him M&Ms and he quieted down, but Hope continued to scream even when William fed her M&Ms one by one, tenderly putting them into her mouth. Her screaming was getting the better of me, and I asked her, "Hope, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want?" I was like an actor's nightmare of Stanislavski. Then she said softly, "I don't like you." "You don't like me because I yelled?" "Yes," she said, sobbing. "Oh, Hope," I said, "I'm sorry. Will you stop crying if I'm my regular self again?" "Yes," she said, and stopped crying. William promptly fell asleep, and Hope became her matter-of-fact happy self again. I thought she wanted me to guess a thing she wanted and give that thing to her. In fact, she wanted me to stop asking her what she wanted. When we got home, Hope said, "Will you play with me?" "Yes," I said, "but how about you eat something first?" "No," she said, "play with me first, and then I will eat something." "Okay," I said. She began to decorate the stage, that is a small red couch, and she said, "Here is the audience, here is the stage, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Gigu show." "What is the Gigu show?" "I am a gate," she said, "you open me." She gave me a plastic yellow key. "How do I open you?" I asked. "Here," she said, pointing to her heart, "turn the key." I tapped the yellow key on her heart, and she opened her arms, pretending that her arms were a swinging gate. "Now walk through," she said. I walked through the gate. "Now you," she said. I stood erect, a closed gate. She put the yellow key on my heart and turned. I opened my arms, a gate, and she walked through. She was very pleased, and we did this over and over again. I had underestimated the heart of my little daughter when she was crying. I thought she wanted chocolate milk. She wanted something more, something that didn't cost anything. She wanted to open my heart. She wanted to walk in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah.
Question?
I'm going to ask you all those things I can't ask you when there isn't an audience. So, a lot of the students here are in my writing about medicine class. So I think I have to ask you, your sister's a doctor, you're married to a doctor.
My uncles are all doctors.
You're surrounded by them.
Yeah.
How does that affect your writing and your worldview?
Nobody's ever asked me that before, and it's such a good question. I'm sure that it does affect my worldview, though I don't know how. I mean, my husband, who Jacob knows well, is a doctor and also studied history of science, and that came into our conversations a lot, I suppose. So when I was working on this play in the next room, or the vibrator play, naturally I talked to my husband about the history of the vibrator and sexuality. So in a very concrete way, sometimes the stories he knows come into my plays, like with the clean house. There's a moment where a tree is uprooted and it's made into Taxol, and that came from a story Tony told me about the fact that Taxol, this chemotherapy, was made from tree bark. So there are those concrete things, and then I suppose there's a more philosophical question of how it affects me, and that I don't really know, except that I suppose I bridle sometimes against a compartmentalized, medicalized view of life and art, and in some ways I think I'm writing against it. But in other ways, my family's full of very compassionate doctors who I really have the utmost respect for, and I do think medicine is an art, and not terribly different from writing in that sense. I remember reading that Chekhov said his writing became more objective after he became a doctor, and I don't know if there's any such thing as objectivity. But I think there's something about when you see that wide array of human suffering and experience, you start becoming less prejudiced towards human experience, and in a way that's the right view of a writer, I think, to be writing not just out of a narcissism of your own subjectivity, but to be, bless you, looking at the world with some compassion and some distance.
Do you ever have doctor envy?
No, God, no. I'm so terrible at science, and I don't like blood. I don't like dissecting things.
I feel the same way, but
my only doctor envy has to do with making an impact that's tangible and caring for people in a tangible way, and writing can feel very intangible and abstract sometimes, and you don't know if you're making any tangible difference in the world. But medicine would not be a good calling.
And the other half of it is it's a more intimate question. You've been a patient. Do you think being a patient has influenced your writing or changed your worldview?
Well, I've never been a patient for very long, thank God. Sort of been a patient in the hospital giving birth to babies.
And you've written about your Bell's palsy.
Bell's palsy, well, yeah. But again, very rarely was I a patient. You can't really do anything about Bell's palsy, so you go to the neurologist and they kind of say, well, you have Bell's palsy. Try to move your face. Oh, I can't move my face. Well, you have Bell's palsy, so...
Well, as my students have learned, unfortunately, most medical conditions, you have cancer, sorry.
Right. No, I know, and I know from being around doctors that often what doctors say is, let's wait and see, which is sort of an infuriating thing for a patient to hear.
If you're still alive in 5 years, we'll try to help you.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. Has being a patient changed my writing? I have no idea. Someone else should write a paper about that. I don't know. Other questions you have?
I have lots of other questions,
yes.
but I feel like let me let people ask a few of their own, and then I may jump in with a few more of mine.
Yeah.
Sound workable?
You said at the beginning of, I think it was the first essay, that you said you were not going to have more than one child. You didn't explain why you changed your decision.
Well,
maybe as a writer, did you feel like you were sacrificing? I mean, obviously, you felt like you were sacrificing something. So, what were you like?
Yes. I mean, the writer part of me always wanted to have one child. And then the person that likes to, I mean, in some ways I think we like to replicate our childhood in terms of how many children we have. I had 2 kids in my family, so I thought, I'll have 2. But But I remember it was a very clear decision between me and my husband. I thought, I don't know if I can manage 2 kids and write. And it took us a while to decide to have another child. And then I got pregnant with twins. And I didn't use IVF, and I didn't use fertility treatments. It was just a spontaneous thing. So there I went from 1 to 3 rather quickly. And my husband he grew up with 3 kids, and I think always wanted to have 3. So I feel like Tony is this man who always gets what he wants and is very calm. So that's how we ended up having 3. I think that's...
So that was more of a personal question.
No, that's fine.
And I can follow up with that because a lot of our students, my students, are grappling with how they can be writers and do other things, whether it's being a doctor, raising children. What is the secret to having like a vibrant non-writing life and still being such a successful writer?
Well, it's having a good husband or wife and a good babysitter who you trust. I mean, in a very concrete way. Or having family around, or living with extended family, which I don't have. My family's in Chicago. But, I mean, I think they're very practical things that make your life possible or not possible when you're trying to write and have kids. I mean, it gets very logistical and nitty-gritty how you manage to do it. It's not a philosophical question. It's sort of, how many hours a day do you have? Can you write outside of the home? Can you leave the house for 2 hours while your kids are at preschool? Like today, so my babysitter is in India, and my other backup sitter is sick, got sick from our kids who are all sick. And I'm here tonight. We found a backup sitter. My husband got home from work at 7. So it's all, it's just incredibly boring in a way, that question.
And yet you're a very philosophical, very spiritual person. And yet you have to hire a babysitter. Like, the balance to me is, I'm not a very spiritual, philosophical person, so it's easy for me to hire a babysitter.
Huh. Well, I mean, it's funny. I don't normally talk about my husband at these events, but since Jake is a very good friend of my husband, I find myself talking about him. My husband actually likes organizing things. And so he likes logistics. I don't. I abhor them. So again, in terms of who you choose to marry someone who can do the other stuff. Don't marry another artist.
There you have your wisdom. That's all I've taught you. Somewhere.
I have a question about the way you read. And feel free not to answer it if you don't want to answer it. But it seems to me that this has to be a conscious choice, that you read with very little emotion and very flat, and you let the words come out pretty much in order. You don't even change the pace that much, except very rarely, like at the end of that last story, you raised it up a little bit because it was a very emotional ending there. So obviously, with the theater connections and background, you could do it a lot more dramatically and really try to bring out some of the action and so forth. So I'm guessing it probably has something to do with words and your relationship with words and the way you want them to strike the audience, but I am very curious about it.
It's a lack of skill, to be totally honest. It's not a choice, it's a total lack of skill, and I'm not an actor. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what an actor would do with them. It'd be fun to try. There's this crazy thing at BAM where Frances McDormand was reading this artist lecture. This artist, Susan Bocanegra, was like literally reading out loud, and Fran was speaking it to the audience. And I asked Suzanne, why did you want to do this? And she said, well, because I can't act, and I wanted an actor to interpret it. And Fran can do things that I can't do. So one is it's a lack. 2 is I'm from the Midwest, and we all talk like blah, blah, blah. We talk very flat with no inflection. Am I offending it? Is anyone else from the Midwest here?
Ohio,
It was bound to happen.
As an ethnic Jew from New York, you do speak flat.
Right? I do, right. I mean, I remember going to see Richard Maxwell, who's a playwright, and his characters, he's from Chicago too, and his characters kind of are like blah, 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 and then they kind of trail off to like or blah, blah, blah. And I went to see it with my friend Andy, who's from New York, and he's like, this is outrageously strange, weird. I was like, this is how people talk. This is like realism. So nervous reading in public, so my default is to just focus on the language and not to try to embellish it. I mean, I grew up and my mom is an actress, and my mom would probably embellish it greatly, and I grew up not like that. I grew up writing, fiction and poetry and being focused much more on language, and the whole idea of being on stage in front of people makes me deeply nervous. So that's also why.
At some level, do you think you mistrust the dramatic in terms of the truth value, or that it's distorting something about the...
Well, a good actor will support and kind of find flesh and not put a kind of terrible stamp on it. But I also think some actors who I love have a deadpan way of relating to language, where they really lay the language out there and don't overly paint it. And it's hard to teach that to actors. Do you have a question? Somebody over here did. No? Yeah?
Yeah, so you talk about Ovid's craft and sort of what he is doing, transformations. I'm wondering, when you adapt Ovid for theater, what you hope to carry over.
Well, I adapted Ovid with Eurydice, and wait, say again. What did I wish to carry over?
Yeah, the transformation. You talk about the transformation. So you can't really teach that sort of craft. I'm wondering, when you adapt for the theater, what you want to bring over from his work. What sort of meaning do you try to instill in it?
Well, I think it's something about the pleasure in storytelling and the pleasure in transformation. And for example, with Orpheus and Eurydice, it's a story that's been part of our culture for so long, and so many artists have grappled with it and tried to put their point of view, tried to infuse their point of view into it. And I guess when I wrote that play, I thought, well, so many male artists have written about Orpheus, but I don't know anything about Eurydice. So in case of that particular play, it was, how did this cipher of Eurydice respond to being dead twice? What was it like to die twice, as opposed to what was it like to be Orpheus and lose somebody twice? And that's the only Ovid story I've adapted in a straightforward way. But I think going back to Ovid and thinking about his structure of storytelling was really helpful to me in terms of describing a kind of theater that I love, that I think exists, but we don't necessarily have a contemporary dramaturgical language for it, because if you go to playwriting school, they'll just tell you, the way to make a play is this, make a big arc. And if you go to screenwriting school, they'll say, make a big arc. On page 30, the inciting incident happens. So that's page 10. On page 30, there's a turn. On page 60, there's a turn. Page 90, there's a turn. It's very geometrical, and then it ends on page 120. And in a way, it's almost like a sonnet form, except that I don't think it's beautiful. The way a sonnet form is beautiful. But it's effective, deeply, deeply effective, this arc. And I guess my frustration is that actually that arc is just one geometric model, and that we need to be open to other ways of telling stories. So I think it's helpful to say, well, look, here's Ovid. Shakespeare stole from Ovid. All of his romances were stealing from Ovid. What about that form? What's that called? What does that look like? Yourself?
I know a lot of the things that in those essays at least were kind of from moments in your life. I'm curious, when you sit down to write something, do things kind of come to you like, oh, that's something I need to write about? Or do you actively try to think of things? And it's the latter then. Do you ever try to think of other things, like purposely writing about things in your life? Or is that just kind of like what's in you?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think my plays have a much less autobiographical feeling than some of those essays. So in the plays, I'm sure there's material from my life, but it's in there in a much more unconscious way. And in the case of the essays, I think there were things I wanted to write about that I actually thought were not interesting in play form at all. And I wanted to write about them, but I needed a new form for the experience. And these short essays seem like a way to think and write about the experience without having the obligation of it being a larger form like a play. I don't consciously set out to write about myself, I don't think. But when I write a play, I usually spend about 2 years thinking, oh, I have an idea, and I think, oh, is it a good idea? And if I still have the idea 2 years later, I'll write about it. And if I don't, I'll think, oh, it's not worth spending the next 5 years of my life on, because it takes about 5 years from the moment you think of a play to then sitting down and writing the play for a couple of years, then you workshop it with actors, and finally it goes up. So it has to be something you feel passionate about and you feel has some staying power.
Can I ask you a question? And perhaps it's subjective. I am not a writer of the humanities, but most of my friends, I would say, are people from literature, are poets or writers, and so I know those people as persons. And on the other hand, professionally, I deal a lot with playwrights because I advise them on science, and so it's a very different relationship. One group I know in one way and one group in another, and they seem to be not to be the same type of people somehow. So that, the people I know can jump from essays to poetry, and these are one personality. And playwrights seem to me like people, perhaps because I relate to them in a different fashion, that more people are doing a craft, and they are. I'm not sure if I can find the right way, but do you feel that these are two different types, and you are part of both in some sense? Is there some schism between the playwright and the rest of the people who write or write fiction or write whatever?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think they're...
They get invited to better parties.
Yeah.
And they like to go to parties. They like people. Playwrights tend to, as opposed to fiction writers and poets, who a lot of them I know could stay alone for months on end.
That's absolutely correct. That is my experience.
Playwrights love solitude for short bursts, and then they get really desperate to be in a room with people, to be in rehearsal and hear the thing out loud. And they don't feel done with the thing until they hear it out loud by a human voice. So in that sense, it's more like being a composer, and then you have to get in the room with a violinist or an architect, and you need a contractor to build your blueprint. So in some ways, it's very practical. And I think fiction and poetry is much more platonic, and you can build this beautiful thing, and there it is, you've built it. And it's self-sufficient, it's sufficient unto itself. And plays are not. And I love playwrights, and I love other writers who write in other genres. And I think there's some playwrights who are more literary. Like, I invited the playwright Will Eno to my class at Yale to talk, and he's very literary, and he talked all about the sound of language, and he said, if you go to a church and someone signed the registry and they said, Jesus, please heal my stomach, and you think that's a nice line, well, it's because there are two E sounds and then it ends with a glottal stop, stomach. And I thought, right, that's what Will Eno's thinking about, glottal stops and the E sound. Then I invited Bruce Norris to my class, and he says, I'm not literary, I'm a boob, I don't read anything. I write for actors, I'm an actor, I write blueprints, I'm not a literary person. So I think there are consciously anti-literary playwrights who are writing for the actor's mouth, and it's very muscular. And then you get your literary playwrights who might be more at home in poetry or fiction.
And you started off as a poet.
I did.
How did you figure out that at your core you were more a playwright than a poet, or are you?
Or am I? Well, it's all about finding the right teacher at the right time in your life, I think. Because I had this teacher, Paula Vogel, at Brown University, where Jacob and I both went. And I wanted to be a poet, and I wanted to be a teacher. And I asked Paula to advise my thesis, which was on 19th century, the representation of 19th century actors in the 19th century novel. And Paula said, no, I won't do that, but if you write a play, I'll advise your thesis. And Paula, I think it was Paula's encouragement that led me towards that genre. Honestly, if a poet had encouraged me, I might have been a poet. But I felt I couldn't deal with rejection as a poet. I mean, it's interesting to me hearing your tale about the 44 essays.
Only 41, don't ask.
Yeah.
I can deal with rejection as a playwright. I don't know why. It feels less personal to me. I wrote a poem, I have hundreds of them, and I sent one to the New Yorker once, and they said no, they didn't want it, and I never sent it out again. That was it. It's like, the New Yorker's not going to publish my poem. They solicit poems. But the veil was too thin for me. I just couldn't bear it. I would prefer to have it be personal. Had I had a mentor at Brown who taught me how to cope with rejection, the way Paula taught me to cope with rejection and playwriting, I might have kept doing that. Because Paula was very practical about rejection. She said, look, this career has a lot of rejection. You're going to get 3 kinds of rejection letters, and you have to embrace rejection. One is signed with a pen. You can lick it and see that it's signed. That's a good rejection letter to get. One is a Xerox. That's not so great. One says, send me your next play. That's a really good one to get. One says, come in and meet us, even though we don't like this play. So she kind of taught us how to enjoy and savor rejection, which I think you have to do because you get so much of it when you start out. And later even, too.
I have 21,000 rejection letters, and I didn't know that. I had them all in crates until a woman I was dating told me they were a fire hazard and threatened to call the police. So now
Where
I
are
only
they
have the
now? Did you
highlights.
burn them?
A lot of them are in my parents' attic. So
They are still a fire hazard.
yes, I still have the highlights on the wall. I have one. Somebody took my cover letter and wrote back the cover letter. Some people might find this thing amusing. We cannot imagine why. Never submit here again. So, and then I have my favorite rejection story is George Plimpton, who used to edit the Paris Review, called me once about a story. I'm so excited, and he says, "You're Jacob Appel," and I said, "Yes." "You wrote the story on bird watching?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, we didn't like the story, but I always I'm interested in young men interested in bird watching. Tell me more about that." Painful.
Oh, I love that George Plimpton called you. I didn't know that story.
He invited me bird watching.
Really?
Unfortunately, I know nothing about bird watching. It was all research, so I had to back out.
You might have had designs.
So what's your best rejection?
Well, I remember this play of mine called Melancholy Play was sort of not experimental enough for some people and too experimental for other people. It was on this cusp. So I remember from Salvage Vanguard in Texas, I got a form letter saying, "Please do not send us work again. We like experimental writers like Susan Laurie Parks, la la la." I thought, I love Susan Laurie Parks. I'm so offended. And then I got another letter from a more traditional theater saying, "We don't know what this is, but it's not a play." And I thought, oh, they don't even think it's a play. Like, it's just not even ontologically, like, it doesn't exist to them.
So actually, I will share with the audience the best rejection I ever got. At the height of the debate on death panels, some of you know I'm a bioethicist at the hospital. I wrote a letter to the Obama administration volunteering to serve in a death panel. And I got back a wonderful form letter where somebody clearly had written the word death panel into the letter, thanking me for my offer and telling me they would consider my application. I will bring in a copy for the kids in my class, for the students in my class.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I've always personally found it very difficult to read plays because on some level, like, I feel like I should see them and hear them. So how do you go about reading other people's plays, and how would you recommend that? How does one relate to reading a play?
It's such an interesting question, and I think plays are awful to read. They're awful. And the best way to read them is to read them out loud, or to read them with friends. They're really in oral form. However, having said that, this frustrates me about plays, and so when I started writing them, I wanted them to feel more readerly and less like blueprints, so I insisted on things like not having stage directions in parentheses, because I just found it sort of muddy, and like you're wading through all this typographical stuff to get inside the playwright's head. So I think in terms of writing a play that's more readerly, you can try to structure your voice on the page so that it feels more intimate with the reader. And then in terms of reading plays, you can read more contemporary playwrights, I think, who are doing that, so it feels more readerly. I mean, even when you read Shakespeare, it's like, oh, there's all this stuff, and it's not even him, it was some typographer writing, like, exunt and brackets and
Followed by
translations, and you can't get to the language. And in that case, I'd say read it out loud. Invite friends over and read it.
And yet you have these beautiful stage directions that are never heard by the audience. Like where you, in one of your plays where there's an artificial horse, and you point out it need not be a real horse. So if it's really only about what you hear, what about these beautiful stage directions?
I love that you think that one's beautiful. It's so practical. It's because artistic directors would flip through and say, a horse, we're not doing this play. Very literal. But I think stage directions are sort of a love letter to the reader, and also to your collaborators, so to the actors, the designers, the directors, so that some of it gets transmitted on the stage in terms of what they create, and you don't know how much will get through. So it's never read by the audience, but maybe it's felt by them or experienced by them in some way. I mean, it's always amazing when you go see a play of yours, and Jacob has seen plays of his in cities where he hasn't been involved in rehearsals, and it can either be a violent, horrible experience, I mean, just aesthetically violent, like when I went to Germany to see Eurydice, which was Eurydice in Germany, and of course it was humorless. Of course it was like 4 hours long, and of course they had added a prologue by Heiner Müller while people danced around in bathing suits, and they all had clown makeup, and that was horrible. But I've had other experiences where you go to another city and people have read your mind. Maybe they've read your stage directions with such care that something's transmitted, and you think, my God, how did you read my mind? But yeah, I'm never going to Germany again to play. Anyway. Have you had that experience of going to see a play of yours and thinking, oh, that's exactly what I intended?
Well, it's more, I'm just still at the stage where I'm still flattered they put my play up, that anything they do with it. They hired real actors to do this, just dumbfounds me.
It's true.
Sort of like I'm in a bookstore and somebody comes up and looks at my book and they might buy it and they change their mind, and I feel the need to like buy it for them and run after them and give it to them. You've reached the point where you've outgrown that, probably.
It's still exciting to have a book, tangible thing. It's wonderful.
It's exciting to have a play, like real people acting it.
It can be wonderful when it is. When it's not, it can be terrible.
I just want to say I've also taken my children to Zipporah Rosenfeld and sat in her kitchen while she picked bugs.
You have?
Yes. and watching her make money like hand over fist, right?
It's good money.
It's good money. But no, I just really appreciated that, after you talk about the life mothering balance and how like getting lice is really like the most frustrating experience in your life. Like there's nothing more like infuriating than lice and like all the laundry, and like it just if there's something that feels like it's getting in the way of your art, it's lice, right? So it just was very refreshing to hear you turn that on its head.
I love that you even know Zipporah.
Oh yeah, East 2nd Street.
She's like the one. Like nobody else is anywhere else.
There are others, but I remember when I was there for like the second time, my daughter Anna just had her lice checked at school, and Zipporah was really impressed because Anna just had like a couple nits. So Zipporah called her mom and was like, "Were you the lice checker? Because whoever it was really good."
Yeah, I've used my skills on other kids since going to her. Like, the smell of Pantene will never be the
Pantene,
same.
oh my God, Pantene. Well, this is the thing. It's almost like this lice is like sort of the anti-literary thing. It's like the thing that sucks the life out of you and sucks the time out of you, and yet that's where you're at. That's what you're doing. So maybe I should give her that essay when I inevitably will go back.
You should invite her to read with you. You should do a stage show together.
Stage directions, you could have a whole play.
Well, it is like such a theatrical setting because all of these people from all walks of life are coming in, and you're having this very intimate. I mean, you and I both have long hair. I'm sitting there for hours. Like it's a very interesting.
And it's oddly calm, just calming.
Yeah, I know.
And there's tons of kids around. Anyway, we could talk later about the life.
Another question? There you go.
Yeah.
I forget exactly what you said, but you said something that you lack, or you think you lack organization skills. How do you think, if at all, that's affected your writing?
I should say, I think I have structural skills, because you have to have it as a playwright. I lack interest in real space and time, sometimes. And so I think that's good for a writer. I think it's helpful to be able to go out of that for a time.
Like in what ways?
Like you have a scene where one character throws an apple in the air and then it lands in the next scene.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the sense that, you know, when you're writing, theoretically, time will pass, and you're unaware of it passing when you're really in a good state. So you sit down and you think 5 minutes have passed and an hour has gone by, and it's time to pick up your kid from school. And I think that's good, to be able to transcend materiality and kind of the dumb logistics of everyday life. It's something it's something you battle with, because I think it's easier when you're an artist and you don't have family life to contend with, which has all that level of organization. But and I don't mean to say that I don't think artists are flaky. I've only lost one car. I don't know. It's an interesting question. Are you a writer?
Say yes. Say yes after a semester.
But do you have organizational skills?
I don't know.
I mean, the good thing is if you're a writer and you have organizational skills, then you can get a great job doing something else and write also. And if you don't have those skills, then you can only write. In some ways it makes it easier because you don't have a choice. I think, well, I better write because I'd be a bad doctor, a bad marine biologist, bad congresswoman.
Bad architect.
Bad architect. Oh, very bad.
Sorry, I mean, kind of, I don't know how the two are connected, but kind of what I was hoping to get at is, if you have something in your head, how do you put that on paper? And I'm thinking like you would have to have some organization in order to do that, but is it more like a fluid, like your head, your hand, the paper?
I think it's fluid at the beginning. It's like a great vomiting forth, a great rush, an ecstatic rush of getting it down. And then I think the kind of structural part, the cognitive part, comes as in rewrites. And I find that there are two kinds of writers: those that love rewriting and the first draft scares them because they don't like that kind of, they're afraid of that spontaneity, and writers who love the first draft and get very bored by subsequent drafts because they don't like being cognitive and organizing everything. My daughter Hope loves organizing things. I find it so bizarre. She'll take out all her clothes and organize them, and when she builds with her magnetiles, she has to structure them. She has to put them in piles of the colors before she begins building. I think, just build already. Like, I don't want to organize all the tiles first. But a good builder or a good cook in the kitchen probably would organize first. And I think it's just two approaches to writing, because some writers will outline first and know the end first, and then they plot it all out and they write. I think it's a perfectly wonderful way to write. And I don't do that. I don't know where I'm going until I get there. And then my hope is, if I'm discovering in the act of writing, then the audience will be in the act of discovering when they're watching it move through time. And I get bored when I know the ending, and then I have to madly rush to it. But I think there's room for all kinds of minds, all kinds of writing minds. You have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask about your writing regimen. You can answer that either pre or post children. Just like how you
Pre, I made sure I left the house by 10:30 and was at a cafe by 11 writing, from 11 to 2. And then I'd do my other things in the morning or the late afternoon. Post having kids, I don't know. I mean, it's just been a mad dash. So I can give you an example. Today, I dropped, one kid was sick and was home with the backup sitter. The other kid I dropped off at preschool, which was a 2-hour preschool, ran to my office room that I'm renting in Park Slope, wrote for half an hour, made one work phone call, took a 20-minute nap, raced back, pick up the kid, pick up my other kid, bring them home, cook dinner, print out my pages that I'm going to read tonight, and then come here. So, it's very different. It's very oh my God, there's a 2-hour window to do everything in. And in some ways it makes you much more focused. you don't sort of think, oh, I'll dream, I'll look out the window. I mean, right now I have a room in my apartment that theoretically should be my office and is really a glorified TV room for my kids watching, Robin Hood on Netflix. But there's a really beautiful view of the Staten Island Ferry, and when I moved in, I thought, oh, I'll gaze out the window and look at the water and the ferries. And instead, my kids watch TV there, and I rush to Park Slope to this woman's house and, stare at the wall.
You feel like you need like a separate space though from like the home?
I think I do. I really do, because I think, Virginia Woolf called it a room of one's own, but she didn't have kids. She just had Leonard, doting on her, and she had apparently a cook. And when the cook didn't cook the right kind of food, she said she couldn't write well. And so she fired the cook for a while, and then she couldn't write, so she rehired the cook. I feel like I don't have a cook.
Yeah, writers don't get cooks anymore.
They don't get cooks. They don't, a long-suffering Leonard at my side. Anyway, so I do think if you have kids, it's nice to actually leave the house. I know some fiction writers who claim that they can shut the door and their kids won't bother them. They must have better discipline in their houses than I do.
Or a lot of Benadryl.
Joan Didion line, quiet mommy's typing.
Oh, wait, did she say that?
I think so.
Oh. Well, and then there's Alice Munro had a piece about how she wrote, I think she had 3 kids, or maybe 2, but she had a kind of beautiful piece about writing while looking at her kid looking up from the crib. And that she was only able to write when her kids were napping, and she found that very peaceful. I would never be able to write while a kid was napping, because at every moment I would think, oh, they're about to wake up and interrupt me.
It's interesting that nobody ever asks male writers about what it's like to be a father of kids and also be a writer.
Do you think they will increasingly, with things changing, with who takes care of kids at home?
I wonder, because I've been to lots of readings where the male writer is also like a primary caregiver, and yet still people don't ask.
Well, I invited the discussion maybe because these essays were so much about that. But I guess part of the reason I feel passionate about inviting the discussion is that, at least in the theater, sometimes I feel like you have to come out as a parent in the theater in the same way you would if you were coming out in some other regard, because I feel like the life of the theater is so not set up for parenting. It's like tech is on Thanksgiving, sorry, or we're rehearsing on some major holiday, and
no children under 5.
Yeah, so I feel like you have to be forthright and say, this is a part of my life, and I'm trying to balance these 2 things together. And I feel like the more that people do that, men and women, the more that it will be a receptive place for parents. And I skulk around and hide the fact that, I think it goes back to the lice essay, but I think our normal state of being was probably working with your children around whatever form of work you had. I think it's actually very odd, the kind of incredible separation we have in industrialized life. So for me, I guess it's just more comfortable to blur the boundary a little bit.
It's interesting. When I was a kid, my father took me to the hospital all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Doctors do not do that anymore.
Because of MRSA. Maybe.
Probably because some of it is health, but I think a lot of it is just the culture of the hospital has changed a lot. It's not a family welcoming place in the same way.
Interesting.
Much more professionalized.
I don't think our country likes children. I don't think we like to see them. I don't think we like to hear them. When you're on an airplane, no one wants to see them or hear them. It's just like you're a blight. In other countries, it's like, oh, you have kids, because kids are a part of life. And in this country, I feel like there's a real lack of compassion for kids and what
and the elderly.
need in public. And
you get this little narrow window.
Yeah. Well, because they're not industrialized workers. They're not capable of contributing to the economy.
This is a spurious observation, feel free to tell me, but that's interesting considering that the stage is always children's play. I always found that interesting that children on stage are usually represented by dolls.
Mm-hmm. I have another essay called Dogs and Children on Stage about that phenomenon a little bit. I think I love a child on stage when they're not acting, and I hate a child on stage when they're like a little professional Muppet, and they're, you know, I find it so disturbing in a way. But I mean, I guess I grew up around the theater. My mom was an actress in Chicago, and she would take me to rehearsal, and she would put us in plays as kids. And so growing up, it felt like a place where you could have a family, and a place where kids were welcome. And I brought my oldest kid, Anna, to rehearsals a lot. And then when I had twins, it became less tenable. I was doing Virginia Woolf's Orlando. I did an adaptation of it. It was right after I had the twins. And because I was breastfeeding, I would bring one of them every other day, and two seemed like too many. And the costume designer thought I was dressing my child as a boy one day.
Brilliant.
How are we doing on time? Are we?
I think we're okay. It's 9:20, so you decide when to call it wraps.
Well, do we have any other questions, or we can always hang out for a few minutes and I take individual questions from people. Some of you may have secret questions you don't want to ask in front of others. I've learned.
If that is the case, perhaps we should go to that. There is a little bit of food and coffee. And
we will mill about. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for your
This was wonderful. It was really, really wonderful.